They told me that dying for the Emperor was the greatest honor a soul could earn, that to be chosen among the countless billions was to be anointed in light. But as the chains tightened around my wrists and the air grew heavy with incense and blood, I wondered if honor had any place left in this galaxy of dust and ruin. The procession had begun long before I understood what it meant to be called to the Golden Throne. They said my voice would join the chorus that fuels his eternal flame, that my mind would dissolve into the Astronomican's boundless radiance, so that others might find their way through the void. Yet in the hidden dark between each chant, I could feel it, the gnawing whisper that maybe this was not salvation, but consumption. The throne does not give, it devours. Still, the idea of purpose is a potent drug. Even now, as I recall the slow descent through the catacombs of Terra, past the banners of forgotten crusades and the statues of hollow heroes, I remember the stillness that settled over me. Fear had long since burned away, leaving only a strange calm, the peace of knowing that the end had already been written by hands not my own. Somewhere above, the custodians watched in silent gold, their eyes unreadable. The Mechanicus adepts hummed their binary prayers. The faithful wept, and beneath it all I thought I could hear it, a heartbeat so vast that it swallowed the world entire. If this story reaches you, know this: I am already gone. What remains is only the echo of a soul offered to a God who no longer answers. Chapter 1. The Pilgrimage of Flesh. They came for me at dawn, though dawn on Terra is not what most imagine. The sky above the hive spires is not blue, but a deep, rusted gray, choked by centuries of incense, smoke, exhaust, and the drifting ash of burned devotion. It was not the light that woke me, but the sound, the toll of a sanctified bell echoing through the hab corridors, followed by the rhythm of boots. The air was heavy with recycled moisture and the faint copper tang of blood. I had heard those steps before, always at a distance, always on the day someone was taken. None ever returned. My cell was small, a cubicle carved into the wall of the Administratum archive where I'd spent my years copying data slates, sealing decrees, and stamping documents that no living man would ever read. The light flickered above me as the door hissed open. 3 figures entered, 2 robed adepts and 1 silent custodian. Even half seen through the haze of incense, the custodian's armor shone with impossible perfection, each plate reflecting the room's ruin back at me in mocking brilliance. He said nothing. The adepts spoke in the measured tone of liturgical duty, informing me that my service had been noted, my faith commended, and my destiny ordained. They called me chosen. The word settled over me like frost. I had imagined once that being chosen by the Imperium meant ascension, a new rank, a greater task, a reward for obedience. But the adept's tone was too solemn, their eyes too hollow. They recited the rite of offering, each line a nail driven into the coffin of my name. I was to report to the Basilica of the Heliarch by the next bell. No farewells, no possessions. Only purity of flesh and surrender of will. When they left, the silence in their wake was unbearable. I stared at my hands, ink-stained and trembling, and wondered how many others had sat in this same place believing themselves loyal servants, only to be transformed into fuel. Outside, the corridor thrummed with life, servitors dragging relics, pilgrims murmuring prayers, the distant roar of transport craft crossing the polluted sky. It all seemed impossibly far away from me now, as though I were already half erased. I walked the length of the hive's upper levels with a procession of others, hundreds, perhaps thousands, each marked with the sigil of selection. Some wept, some sang. Most simply stared ahead, numb with resignation. The air smelled of sweat and machine oil, the mingled scent of faith and decay. Above us, banners depicting the Imperial Aquila fluttered in the filtered light, its twin heads watching in eternal judgment. Children reached out from the crowd to touch our robes, whispering blessings. Somewhere, deep within the metal canyons of the hive, I could hear the rhythmic thud of industry, manufactura producing weapons, armor, and endless death for a war none of us would ever see. By the time we reached the transport platforms, the day had bled into night, though the difference was meaningless here. Gunships waited, their hulls painted with devotional sigils, their machine spirits humming softly. Mechanicus priests moved among them, chanting to appease the engines. When my turn came, I stepped aboard and felt the floor vibrate beneath my boots as the vessel's systems came alive. Through the narrow view slit, I watched the city fall away, towers of habitation and decay stretching to the horizon, a labyrinth of human suffering bathed in sanctified light. The journey to the palace was long, measured not in distance but in transformation. We passed checkpoints guarded by the Astra Militarum, their faces hidden behind rebreathers, their eyes reflecting the same cold emptiness I felt growing within me. The further we traveled, the cleaner the air became, until the scent of ozone replaced that of rust and rot. At last, the gunship descended through layers of defense that no human mind could comprehend. Void shields, energy barriers, automated sentinels, each layer more sacred and forbidden than the last. And then, for the first time, I saw the Imperial Palace. It rose from the bones of Terra like a mountain forged of gold and sorrow. Its walls were vast enough to drown cities, its towers so tall they vanished into the clouds. Every surface was alive with carvings, scenes of conquest, martyrdom, and worship, each etched by hands long dead. Pilgrim lines stretched for kilometers at the gates, their torches flickering like fireflies against the colossal doors of adamantine. I felt myself shrink before it, reduced to nothing, a mote of dust standing before eternity. We disembarked in silence. The custodians awaited us, towering figures of perfection and terror. They did not speak, yet their mere presence commanded absolute obedience. A single gesture sent us kneeling. Prayers filled the air, half chanted, half screamed, as incense thickened the wind. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of fear and awe, I felt a flicker of understanding. The Imperium was not built on faith alone. It was built on the weight of sacrifice. Billions of lives ground to dust to keep the machinery of godhood turning. When the gates opened and the light poured out, it was not warm. It was blinding, searing, pure, a light that judged every thought and stripped every lie. I raised my head, and for an instant, I thought I could hear it, a voice, distant and ancient, echoing through the stone. It was not language, not even sound. It was command. It was hunger. I stepped forward with the others, and the gates closed behind us like the jaws of a beast. Inside the palace, the air felt different, thicker, charged with a low vibration that thrummed through my bones. The walls were alive with the memory of prayer, every surface engraved with the language of the Imperium's faith. Great statues lined the hallways, their faces worn smooth by the touch of countless pilgrims. The light came not from lamps, but from sanctified braziers filled with burning oils that smelled of promethium and myrrh. Somewhere above, organ pipes released waves of sonorous hymns, harmonizing with the constant murmur of billions praying beyond the gates. The sound was so vast that it ceased to be sound at all. It became atmosphere, a sea of devotion that drowned the mind. We were herded through corridors vast enough to house entire regiments. Custodians stood sentinel at every archway, their weapons gleaming like polished relics. I caught glimpses of their faces, human and yet beyond human, each feature carved from discipline and duty. They were the closest thing to gods I had ever seen, and they moved with the stillness of statues. The adepts spoke little. When they did, it was only to correct posture, command silence, or quote the canticles of binding. No one disobeyed. We passed through the hall of petitioners, where those deemed unworthy of sacrifice knelt in eternal penance. They were not corpses, yet not alive. Their bodies fused into the marble by layers of sanctified resin, their faces frozen in pleading expressions. Their lips moved soundlessly, forever mouthing prayers that would never reach the throne. I remember staring too long at one of them, a woman whose eyes still seemed wet. A custodian's gauntleted hand brushed my shoulder, not roughly, but enough to remind me that I was not to linger. The message was clear. Mercy was not a virtue here. At last we reached the Basilica of the Heliarch, where our names, what little remained of them, were recorded for the final time. A line of scribes sat behind an altar of obsidian, their faces hidden behind porcelain masks shaped in mock serenity. They wrote our ident codes into great ledgers bound in human skin, the ink a mixture of ash and sanctified blood. When I signed, the stylus drew more than words. It drew the last of myself. The scribe stamped my forehead with the sigil of offering, and the scent of burning flesh filled the air. After that, we were taken to the purification chambers. The adepts stripped us bare, shaving our heads, removing every mark of individuality. The water they used was not water at all, but a chemical mixture that stung like acid. They scrubbed until skin peeled, murmuring binary psalms as they worked. When they finished, our bodies glistened raw beneath the flickering lumen strips. We were draped in thin white robes, their fabric coarse and heavy with incense. A final anointing followed, a drop of sacred oil placed upon the tongue, bitter as iron. I remember the silence that followed. For the first time, I understood what it meant to be empty, not in spirit, but in thought. My memories began to fade, blurred by exhaustion and reverence. The hive, my work, my name, all seemed distant, as though belonging to someone else. The Adepts told us that such emptiness was purity. Only those who surrendered the self entirely could serve the Emperor truly. Yet I wondered then, as I do now, if purity was merely the word they gave to annihilation. From the purification chambers, we were led into a vast amphitheater, its ceiling lost in shadow. At the center stood a dais of black stone, upon which burned a single golden flame. Around it, robed priests chanted the lament of flesh, their voices merging into a single unbroken tone. It vibrated through the air, through the walls, through my ribs. I felt it in my teeth, my blood, my bones. It was not song, but command, a psychic resonance that compelled every pilgrim to kneel. When the flame brightened, I thought I saw shapes within it, wings, faces, eyes that burned without mercy. Some of the pilgrims screamed. Others began to laugh, overcome by ecstasy or madness. I simply wept, not from fear, but from understanding. The light was not beautiful. It was consuming. It was the same light that filled the Astronomican, the same fire that burned 1,000 souls each day to keep the galaxy from falling into dark. As the chant rose to its final pitch, a voice echoed through the hall, amplified by unseen vox grills. It was the voice of a confessor, though he spoke as though from another world. His words were slow, deliberate, and terrible in their certainty. He spoke of duty and sacrifice, of the Emperor's eternal hunger and the honor of being chosen to feed it. Each phrase was a blade drawn across the mind, carving away doubt until only obedience remained. When he finished, the flame guttered, leaving behind only the smell of burnt oil and the sound of our breathing. The custodians moved forward again, silent as ghosts, and we rose at their gesture. Ahead lay a door of black steel, etched with the sigil of the throne. Beyond it, the descent would begin. I looked once more at the flame, at the shadow it left on the walls, and thought, this is how gods are fed. The descent began without ceremony. The great doors opened, and a chill gust swept through the chamber, smelling of ozone and rust. 1,000 footsteps echoed down the stairway that spiraled into the earth, the sound of countless pilgrims swallowed by the dark. The air grew denser with each step, the light behind us fading until only the glow of lumen strips guided the way. I could feel the weight of Terra above, millions of tons of sacred stone pressing down as though the planet itself sought to reclaim us. The corridors narrowed, the ceilings lowered, and the air filled with the hum of unseen machinery. Servo skulls drifted past, their eyes glowing with red lumens, whispering fragments of catechism as they recorded our passage. Occasionally, a Mechanicus acolyte would appear from an alcove, their limbs replaced with gleaming augmetics, their flesh tattooed with binary code. They did not look at us as people, but as inventory, another shipment of biomass for the engine of faith. Each one murmured a different canticle, some in praise, others in data speech too fast to follow. I began to realize that we were no longer pilgrims but cargo. We passed through chambers filled with incense thick enough to choke, where cherubs hovered above with tiny sensors, their wings fluttering weakly under the weight of their burden. The scent was overwhelming, cloying, and sweet, designed to disguise the underlying rot that permeated these depths. For beneath the sanctity there was decay. I saw it in the cracked tiles, the flaking gold, the trails of dark fluid leaking from the mouths of ancient conduits. The palace was eternal, yes, but eternity here was built on corrosion and maintenance, faith and flesh holding back collapse. Further down, the temperature dropped. Frost formed along the walls, glittering like starlight in the dim lumen. The Adepts told us to remain silent. Voices carried here, they said. The echoes had a way of returning not as they were sent, but changed, warped into whispers that did not belong to any living tongue. I tested it once, under my breath, murmuring my own name just to remember how it sounded. The air gave no answer, but the back of my neck prickled as though something had heard. I never tried again. Hours, or perhaps days, passed. Down here, time dissolved. The procession had lost all sense of rhythm, moving more from habit than command. Some collapsed, their strength spent. They were dragged aside by servitors, their fates unspoken. We did not ask where they were taken. To speak their loss would have been to invite the same mercy. The path eventually opened into a cavern so vast I could not see its end. The walls glowed faintly with power lines, and in the distance I saw titanic pylons reaching upward like the ribs of some colossal beast. At the center rose a single tower of black steel, crowned with a golden sigil that pulsed in time with the low thrum of the earth. The Adepts called it the Gate of Resonance. Beyond it lay the Sanctum Imperialis, the threshold to the Golden Throne itself. But no one crossed untested. Here, our final measure would be taken. We were lined before a dais where a Magos Biologis awaited, his body a patchwork of metal and shriveled flesh. Tubes snaked from his back into machines that hummed with a heartbeat rhythm. His face was half hidden behind a respirator, his eyes twin lenses that focused on each of us in turn. He carried a staff crowned with a vial of glowing fluid, the blood of saints, they said. When he spoke, his voice was a blend of static and sermon. He told us we would be scanned, measured, and recorded, that only those of perfect psychic alignment would ascend to the throne. The rest would serve in other capacities. His words were neither cruel nor kind. They were simply fact. When my turn came, I stepped forward. The Magos extended a thin metal claw that pierced my palm. The fluid he drew shimmered in the light, changing colors as it fed into his instruments. Runes flickered. Vox grills crackled. Then he made a small sound, not approval, not disappointment, and gestured for me to proceed. I do not know what he saw, only that I was not cast aside. Those deemed unfit were taken down a side corridor, escorted by servitors whose arms ended in syringes and blades. Their screams were brief, then gone. The rest of us continued forward, our steps echoing hollowly against the steel floor. The Gate of Resonance loomed ahead, a portal inscribed with shifting symbols that shimmered as if alive. The air around it vibrated, and I could taste metal on my tongue. When I crossed the threshold, everything changed. The hum deepened into a pulse that resonated with my heartbeat. My thoughts scattered like dust in a storm. The Adepts had warned us that the throne's presence could be felt even here, hundreds of meters away, its psychic field extending like the breath of a slumbering god. It was more than power. It was gravity of the soul. I felt it pulling at me, not my body, but the essence within, tugging towards something vast and burning. We were told this was the point of no return. Beyond here, there was only offering. I looked back once. The faces behind me were pale and expressionless, eyes glassy with devotion or fear. Ahead, the corridor sloped further into shadow, and the sound of machinery became indistinguishable from prayer. I inhaled the cold electric air and took one step forward. Somewhere in the darkness, a single word echoed through my mind, not spoken, not heard, but known. Serve, and I did not resist. Chapter 2. The Descent Beneath Terra. The descent continued long after I believed the world could hold no further depth. The air thickened, alive with vibration, as if the very planet were breathing in slow, tectonic rhythm. Around us, the walls changed from carved stone to dark alloy, each panel marked with the sigils of the Mechanicum and the sacred hexagrams of containment. The air smelled of machine oil and sanctified ozone. Servitors hung suspended from the ceilings, their bodies grafted into the structure itself, flesh and wire indistinguishable, their mouths murmuring static hymns that kept the machine spirits calm. It was said that if even one chant faltered, the machinery of the throne could shudder, and the light of the Astronomican might flicker. I remember the way my footsteps echoed, not hollow, but resonant, as though each sound was absorbed and answered by something beneath. The Adepts called this level the Submechanicum, though it was less a place than an organism, veins of data and power cables pulsing with light like arteries. The deeper we went, the more I felt my sense of self begin to wane, as though each meter stripped away another layer of who I had been. Perhaps that was the intention. To reach the throne, one must first become hollow enough to contain the Emperor's will. We passed through airlocks guarded by Skitari cohorts, their visors reflecting the dull gold of the lumen. They stood motionless, rifles in hand, their augmetic limbs humming with quiet menace. The adepts exchanged bursts of Binharic code, and the doors opened one after another with the sigh of releasing pressure. Beyond lay corridors draped with hanging cables, and the flicker of arc lights cast long shadows that shifted like living things. At intervals, we crossed bridges spanning chasms so deep the light vanished before it reached the bottom. Far below, I could hear the grind of titanic machinery, gears larger than cathedrals turning in eternal rhythm. The sound was strangely soothing, a heartbeat of the Imperium itself. I wondered how many had walked this same path over the millennia, how many souls had been carried downward to feed the same unending hunger. The thought was vast enough to swallow the mind. Our guides, the Adepts, began to chant as we moved. Their voices blended into a low drone, half prayer, half mechanical code. Each syllable seemed to vibrate against my skull, shaping the air into patterns I could almost see. I realized they were not merely speaking. They were tuning us, aligning our minds to the frequency of the place. Every breath became part of the rhythm. Every heartbeat matched the pulse of the walls. The more I listened, the less I could tell where my thoughts ended and the chant began. At one point, the procession halted before a shrine carved directly into the alloy bulkhead. Within it burned a faint golden light. The shape was simple, a figure of the Emperor seated upon his throne, eyes closed, hand raised in benediction. But the material was wrong. It wasn't metal. It looked organic, its surface faintly porous, almost breathing. One of the Adepts stepped forward and bowed deeply, pressing a small data slate against the figure's chest. The shrine absorbed it. A hum passed through the floor and a door slid open ahead. No one questioned it. Faith in the Imperium was not trust in logic. It was trust in continuity. The belief that the ritual itself, repeated over uncounted centuries, was reason enough. As we continued downward, the air grew warmer, and a faint luminescence bled through the walls, not from artificial light, but from psychic discharge. It shimmered faintly in the air like heat haze. The Adepts began to wear hoods lined with silver threads to protect their minds, and I could feel pressure building behind my eyes, like a storm trapped beneath the skull. Some of the others began to mutter prayers, the words stumbling from their lips like children learning speech. We entered a corridor where the walls were lined with glass tubes, each containing a human figure, or something that had once been human. Their bodies floated in viscous fluid, limbs stretched and distorted, eyes closed. Labels marked them as failed conduits. The sight chilled me more than anything above had. For the first time, I understood what failure meant here. Not death, but eternal suspension, caught forever between life and dissolution. The Adepts ignored them as if they were decorations. To them, the price was necessary, the process sacred. But to me, it was the first glimpse of the truth behind the myth. That salvation in the Imperium was not the gift of gods, but the machinery of sacrifice built upon the silence of the consumed. One of the figures drifted close to the glass as I passed. Its face brushed the barrier, the skin pale, the eyes suddenly open. I saw my reflection in those empty sockets before the lumen flickered, and the thing was still again. I did not look back. The tunnels widened again after that, but the air did not ease. It grew heavier, the psychic pressure thickening until thought itself seemed to echo. I could feel the presence of others. Not the pilgrims beside me, but minds somewhere deeper, vast and burning, their emotions bleeding faintly through the veil. Pain, devotion, unity. The choir. Even from this distance, their collective agony radiated through the rock like heat. The Adepts whispered that we were nearing the sanctum's perimeter, where the resonance of the throne could be felt directly. Everywhere the signs of age showed. The walls were cracked with the strain of 10,000 years, patched and repatched by Mechanicus labor. Cables bundled in great veins hung from the ceiling, each marked with purity seals. I could hear them humming, the sound alive, like the breath of a slumbering machine. The Adepts called this song the Litany of Transmission, the heartbeat of the Imperium. If it ever ceased, they said, the galaxy itself would fall silent. The procession slowed before a great archway guarded by 2 custodians. They stood motionless, their armor reflecting the blue-white glow of the lumen strips. Between them was carved a warning in high Gothic. Here lies the path of dissolution. Only the willing may tread. The Adepts fell to their knees and recited the oath of unmaking, a prayer that stripped all claim of self before entry. I repeated the words, though their meaning felt less like faith and more like surrender. Each syllable seemed to peel away memory, leaving me raw, exposed, transparent. When the oath was done, the gates opened. Heat washed over us. The air shimmered, and a metallic taste filled my mouth. Ahead stretched a hall so enormous it defied reason. Pillars carved in the likeness of angels supported a ceiling lost in light. Along the walls, rivers of molten gold flowed in channels, casting reflections that danced across the floor like liquid fire. But even through the beauty, I sensed a weight, an immense pressure that seemed to bend space itself. The adepts instructed us not to look up. I did. Above the pillars hung massive forms suspended by chains, broken constructs of flesh and machine, their purposes long forgotten. Some resembled men, others beasts, all fused into the architecture. They twitched occasionally, as if caught between dreaming and waking. I realized with a slow horror that these were remnants of older systems, predecessors to the current mechanisms that sustained the throne. Failed prototypes preserved as warnings or trophies. We marched on. The floor beneath my feet trembled faintly with the pulse of distant power. The hum became a vibration I could feel in my teeth. I noticed now that the adepts no longer led with certainty. Their chants wavered. The custodians at the rear moved closer, silent, ensuring none strayed or faltered. At the center of the hall stood a machine unlike any I had seen. A massive, vertical ring, spinning with impossible grace. Its surface glowed with symbols that shifted each time I blinked, patterns older than language. Inside the ring hung a veil of energy that shimmered like water. The adepts called it the Gate of Purity. To pass through it was to be measured, cleansed, and prepared for communion with the throne. One by one, we stepped forward. When my turn came, the custodian gestured. I approached, the heat prickling my skin. As I neared the veil, I felt a pull, not on my body, but on my mind. Images flashed before my eyes, memories, fears, every lie I had ever spoken. They peeled away like paint under flame. I tried to resist, to hold something back. A name, a face, the faint echo of who I had been. But the light was merciless. It reached inside and tore everything bare. When it was done, I fell to my knees. The world was silent. My vision swam with after-images, a golden field, a sky aflame, the distant sound of thunder. For a moment I thought I had died. But the adepts lifted me to my feet, and I saw others staggering beside me, their eyes blank, their mouths open as if gasping for air that no longer belonged to them. We had been remade. Beyond the gate, the air cooled again. The walls were black now, carved from obsidian glass that reflected our forms as shadows. The floor pulsed faintly beneath my feet as though I were walking upon something alive. A sense of proximity filled me, the unmistakable awareness that the throne was near. I could feel it behind the walls, beyond the veil of matter, radiating power like the heart of a dying star. The adepts warned us not to speak. They said the closer one came, the thinner the boundary grew between thought and reality. A stray idea could become manifestation. A doubt could kill. Silence, then, was survival. We obeyed. At the far end of the corridor, a door awaited, vast and simple, made of dull gold etched with the sigil of the Emperor's eye. As it began to open, I felt the first whisper of something vast slide through my mind, a voice not of sound but of thought itself. It did not speak words. It only noticed. And in that instant of being seen, I understood that I was no longer human. I was becoming an instrument. The doors parted with the slow inevitability of a sunrise. A gust of scorched air rolled through, thick with the scent of burnt ozone and something older, the musk of sanctified decay. Beyond them lay a chamber vast enough to house a city, yet every sound within it was muted, swallowed by the psychic pressure that hung like fog. It felt as though the air itself resisted breath, as if to inhale without permission was a sin. I stepped through the threshold and felt the world tilt, as though gravity itself bowed toward something deeper within. At first, all I could see was machinery, endless rows of conduits running along the walls, rivers of glowing energy pulsing through glass veins, and statues of saints kneeling beside consoles of unknown design. The light was dim and gold, filtering through a haze that seemed not quite natural. It moved with the rhythm of breath, the pulse of an unseen lung. Then, in the distance I saw it, the faint outline of the ascensor bridge, a colossal platform suspended over an abyss that dropped away into infinity. We gathered at its edge, the adepts reciting a litany of permission while servitors clanked forward to engage the bridge's mechanisms. The sound was like thunder muted by centuries of dust. The platform shuddered, then began to descend. Chains thicker than hive spires groaned overhead, their links moving with mechanical precision. Slowly, we were lowered into the dark. The descent through that chasm was unlike any journey I had known. The walls fell away, replaced by the sight of impossible structures. Cathedrals built sideways into the rock, each illuminated by flickering arc flames. I glimpsed balconies lined with monks in crimson robes, their bodies fused to consoles, their mouths whispering in synchronization. Their prayers, carried through vox grills, joined the mechanical hum until it became indistinguishable from the rhythm of the engines themselves. I realized then that every voice in this place, every word ever spoken in its corridors, was part of a single, unending prayer. The adepts said we were nearing the throne's outer sanctum. Even without their words, I could feel it, a growing pressure that seemed to press against the inside of my skull. My thoughts began to stutter, unraveling at the edges. Images flickered across my vision, memories not my own. Soldiers dying on nameless worlds, ships lost to the warp, a child holding a candle before an altar of rust. None of it belonged to me, and yet all of it felt familiar. The Emperor's shadow, they said, touched all minds who drew near. When the bridge halted, it did so with a sound that reverberated through bone. The adepts instructed us to kneel. Before us, across a gulf of dark air, loomed the final gate, a barrier of shimmering gold that rippled like water. Its surface was carved with 1,000 faces, each frozen in expressions of awe or agony. As the lumen strips along the walls flared to life, I realized the truth. They were not carvings. They were remnants, the psychic impressions of those who had come before, burned into reality itself. The lead adept stepped forward and began the rite of integration. His voice was calm, but I saw his hands tremble. One by one he called our names, or what remained of them, and offered them to the gate. Each time he spoke, a face on the golden surface shifted, lips moving in silent response. When my turn came, he paused. Perhaps it was hesitation, perhaps pity. But then he said it, and the sound of it echoed through me, hollow and unrecognizable. The gate opened, light poured out, not blinding, but total, a radiance that had weight and heat. It pressed against the skin like a living thing. I felt the air burn in my lungs and yet did not suffocate. Inside that light I could see shapes moving, vast forms, indistinct, flickering like ghosts behind flame. Some said the custodians guarded the path to the throne, others that they too stood beyond this gate, ceaselessly vigilant. But what I saw were not men. They were silhouettes of purpose, outlines of will made manifest. I felt their gaze pierce through me, seeing everything, judging nothing. We crossed the threshold. The chamber beyond was unlike any other, neither built nor natural, but something between. It was alive with energy, the walls pulsing faintly with light that seemed to come from within the stone itself. The floor vibrated, the air hummed, and every breath tasted of metal and sanctity. At the far end, across an expanse of gleaming metal and shadow, something waited. I could not yet see it, but I could feel it, the source of the heat, the origin of the pull that had guided me from the hive's depths to this sanctum of silence. The throne was near. My legs trembled as I stepped forward, not from fear but from the weight of presence. My mind filled with whispers, thousands of voices murmuring prayers, each word overlapping until they became one sound, one pulse, one will. I could not tell where their thoughts ended and mine began, and then the light grew stronger. The adepts raised their hands in reverence. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of machinery became indistinguishable from a heartbeat. The air shimmered, the metal sang, and I realized with a sudden, perfect clarity that what lay ahead was not salvation. It was consumption, and I walked willingly into its glow. Chapter 3. The Choir Eternal. It began with light, not the dim, trembling glow of lumen strips or the filtered brilliance of cathedral glass, but a light that existed before meaning, raw, absolute, unending. It filled the chamber like an ocean fills a void, flooding every surface, every atom, until form itself became uncertain. The adepts fell to their knees, their robes shimmering as golden motes clung to the fabric like dust from a dying star. The air hummed with power, and for the first time since leaving the hive, I felt small in the truest sense. Not merely insignificant, but erased. Before us rose the golden throne. No description can contain it. To call it a machine is to name a god by the shape of its altar. It was a monolith of gold and black iron, a mountain of circuitry, skulls, and sanctified conduits. Its shape defied focus, a structure and a presence at once, shifting as though it existed across layers of perception. From its heart came rivers of light that flowed upward into the darkness above, vanishing into unseen vaults. Each stream pulsed in rhythm with the Emperor's will, or what remained of it. The sound that filled the chamber was not quite a hum, not quite a hymn, but something between. The Adepts guided us toward a raised platform lined with restraining frames, the conduit thrones. Each was a grotesque fusion of organic and mechanical design, shaped to receive the human form and bind it into stillness. I counted hundreds, perhaps thousands, arranged in concentric circles facing the central throne. Their occupants sat in silence, heads bowed, faces obscured by neural visors that pulsed faintly with light. Tubes ran from their bodies into the floor, carrying streams of shimmering liquid thought, the psychic current that fed the Astronomican. The custodians waited among them, motionless as statues, each holding a staff of office. They were not guards here, but witnesses, eternal sentinels to a process older than empires. No word was spoken between them and the Adepts. None was needed. When the signal came, we were led forward one by one. I watched as the first of my fellow pilgrims was seated, his body strapped into place with steel bands that hissed as they tightened. The Mechanicus attendants worked with precision, their movements devoid of cruelty or mercy. Needles slid into flesh, electrodes kissed temples, and the conduit throne came alive. Light burst along the cables. The man's back arched, his mouth opened in a soundless scream, and then silence. His breathing steadied, his eyes rolled. Upward beneath the visor, and the light in the tubes grew brighter. I was the fourth to ascend. The frame was cold, unyielding. Metal plates closed around my limbs, holding me upright as the Adepts began their work. One inserted a line of crystalline tubing into the vein at my wrist. Another attached an intricate crown of sensors to my scalp, each node glowing as it synchronized with my nervous system. A third murmured a prayer to the machine god, touching my chest with a symbol of the Omnissiah before locking the final restraints. "Your thoughts are now his," one of them whispered, voice filtered through a vox grill. "Let them be pure." The visor descended. The world vanished. At first, there was only darkness, deep and endless. Then, from somewhere distant, a tone began to rise. It was faint, pure, a note so high it trembled at the edge of hearing. Another joined it, then another, until the air, or whatever replaced it here, vibrated with sound. I realized these were voices. Thousands, perhaps millions, each one human once, now fused into a single, seamless resonance, the choir eternal. Their song was not music. It was navigation. Every tone, every harmonic carried the Imperium's light. Across the void, guiding ships through the warp, keeping humanity from vanishing into madness. The sheer magnitude of it staggered me. I could feel the strain behind every note, the pain beneath the perfection. It was beautiful, and it was horrifying. Then the current reached me. It did not enter through the body but through the mind, a surge of awareness that poured into me like molten glass. My thoughts were ripped open, stretched thin, and woven into something larger. I felt them, the others, the uncountable minds around me, singing in patterns so vast they could only be perceived, never understood. Each one was a candle, and together they were a galaxy. I tried to hold on to myself, to remember my name, my reason, but the flood was too strong. I was dissolving. And in that dissolution, I felt the first touch of him, not as a presence, not as a voice, but as gravity, the absolute center of everything. It pulled at me with the inevitability of death, yet beneath it was warmth, faint but real, like the memory of sunlight. I wanted to resist, to remain something separate, but resistance here was meaningless. The throne did not consume, it absorbed. It made all things one, and as my thoughts began to fade into the endless harmony, I understood the terrible truth whispered through the choir. The Emperor still lived, but what lived within that golden cage was no longer human. The moment of merging is impossible to measure. There is no threshold, no dividing instant between self and totality. One breath, you are a single voice trembling in darkness. The next, you are part of the storm that binds the galaxy together. I felt it happen without sensation, not pain, not ecstasy, but a vast expansion of being. My mind unfurled like smoke, drifting into a current that had no beginning or end. There were others all around me, too many to count, each thought brushing against mine like the touch of wind. I could feel their exhaustion, their endless endurance. Some minds had been here for hours, others for years. Some no longer knew what time was. They had become rhythm, pulse and pattern woven into the psychic lattice that burned through the warp. The Astronomican, they said, was light. But from within it was closer to fire, a roaring, endless blaze fed by the steady sacrifice of souls. I had always imagined light as salvation. Here, it was burden. At first I tried to find boundaries, to recognize the edges of thought that still belonged to me. I searched for memory, for the texture of a face or the sound of my own name. But the flood washed it all away. In its place came vision, a sight beyond sight. I saw stars, thousands upon thousands, flickering across the void like embers in the dark. Their light bent around invisible tides, currents of power twisting between them. The warp unfolded before me, a realm of madness and color, where thought was geography and emotion, gravity. Through it, the light of the Astronomican blazed like a wound across infinity, cutting a narrow corridor of safety through chaos itself. I felt the strain of it, the sheer will required to hold that light steady. Every soul in the choir burned a fraction of itself to maintain it. Some had burned so long they no longer remembered the cause. Yet even those who had forgotten still sang, their devotion reduced to instinct. I wanted to ask why, to know whether the Emperor truly guided our voices, or whether we were only remnants, the echoes of a command given millennia ago. But the question dissolved before it could form. Curiosity itself was a luxury of individuality. The current shifted, and I felt the focus of the choir tighten. Somewhere far away, a star system, a fleet, a fragment of humanity adrift in the void, called for the light. The Astronomican flared, the pulse intensified, threads of energy converging through us all. I could see them now. Each soul a conduit channeling the Emperor's will into the warp. It was like standing at the center of a hurricane made of prayer. Every vibration in that storm was meaning, coordinates, guidance, survival. I glimpsed the flicker of a ship, its Geller field sparking, its crew crying out as demons clawed at the veil. And through our song, through our burning, it found its way home. The vision faded, the current eased. I drifted, hollow but whole, if such a word still meant anything. There was no pain, only exhaustion that did not end. The choir never slept. When one voice faltered, another strengthened. When a soul dimmed, it was replaced. I could sense the cycles, the slow, patient rhythm of offering and renewal. New minds arriving, bright and terrified. Old ones fading, their last notes echoing before dissolving into silence. Occasionally, between waves of command, fragments of thought passed through the network. They were not words but impressions, memories that had escaped dissolution. I felt one brush against me once, faint as breath, the image of a child beneath a dying sun holding a candle against the wind. The emotion that came with it was indescribable. Love, fear, devotion intertwined. Then it was gone. And beneath all of it, deeper than the choir's harmonies, something vast stirred. It was not a voice, not even awareness in the way we understood it, but a weight. It pressed through every connection, every thought. When it brushed against me, my mind convulsed. The others around me bent their harmonies instinctively, altering pitch and rhythm, not in rebellion but in reverence. We all felt it, the Emperor's attention, fleeting and unbearable. It was not warmth nor cruelty. It was necessity. In that moment I saw flashes, memory not my own, yet imprinted in the current, legions marching beneath a sunless sky, golden warriors ablaze with righteousness, a figure on a throne of light whose face was both divine and human, and behind it, always behind it, the shadow of a flame consuming itself. The vision passed. The choir steadied. The light continued. But now I understood the truth none dared speak, not even in thought. The Emperor did not command us. He endured us. Our song was not his will made manifest, but his suffering translated into order. We were not voices guided by divinity. We were the pain of a dying God given form, and through that pain, humanity found its way home. Time ceased to mean anything within the choir. It became rhythm, pulse, vibration, a continuous unfolding of will stretched across the warp's horizon. The mind, stripped of its body, no longer knew hunger or sleep. Only the ceaseless motion of thought braided into light. I had once believed eternity would be peaceful, but eternity is merely repetition without end. Each breath of consciousness, each flicker of self that rose within me, dissolved into the current before it could take shape. Yet somehow, a fragment remained, a sliver of awareness that refused to fade completely, clinging to the faint outline of what I had been. That fragment became my vantage, my tether. Through it I began to see the others, not as faces or forms, but as flares of emotion burning in patterns. Some were bright and fierce, newly joined, their thoughts still resonant with humanity. Others were dim, their essence stretched thin across centuries of service. There were even minds so vast and ancient that they no longer flickered at all. Their consciousness diffused through the entire network like ambient light. They were less souls now than pillars of the Astronomican itself. To lose them, I sensed, would be to unmake constellations. Occasionally a tremor passed through the choir, a shudder that rippled through every mind at once. These were the moments of warp interference, when storms raged across the Imperium and demons pressed against the barrier of the Emperor's light. When it happened, the choir burned brighter. Pain surged through every connection as energy was drawn through us, amplified 1,000-fold. I felt my mind crack like glass under pressure, but I did not scream. None of us did. There was no place for screaming here, only the continuation of the song. Once, during such a storm, something touched me. It was not the Emperor. That presence was too immense, too steady. But something else. A shadow that drifted just beyond the harmony. It whispered in patterns that defied understanding, like a melody played backward, filled with shapes and emotions that did not belong to any mortal mind. I felt curiosity, hunger, and something colder, deeper, recognition. The choir recoiled instinctively, adjusting its tone, its psychic frequency twisting to repel the intrusion. The shadow retreated, but not before it brushed across my awareness like ice. For a moment I felt utterly alone, cut off from the others, and the silence that followed was worse than pain. When the connection returned, I was trembling, if trembling can exist without flesh. After that, I began to sense things that others seemed not to notice. Faint echoes beneath the surface of the harmony, murmurs of what might have been words, or dreams, or remnants of prayers left over from lives long extinguished. Some were fragments of memory, a mother's voice, the clang of a forge, the cry of a dying soldier. Others were stranger, glimpses of thought from those who had already dissolved entirely. They spoke of visions, of the Emperor not as a corpse enthroned in silence, but as something vast and manifold, his consciousness scattered across the stars. Some said he reached through them in fragments, guiding the Inquisition, the Astra Telepathica, even the dreams of saints. Others whispered that what sat upon the throne was no longer him at all, that the man who had been emperor was gone, and only the mechanism remained, feeding upon the souls that came to sustain it. But these were whispers only. Within the choir, speculation was heresy even in thought. The psychic fabric itself seemed to tighten when such ideas formed, as if suppressing blasphemy by instinct. Still, I could not silence the questions entirely. What if the Emperor we served was both alive and dead, consciousness dispersed, omnipresent yet fragmented, a pantheon of himself? What if the Astronomican was not a beacon, but a plea? The idea lingered like a spark in ash. I felt others noticing it. Faint touches of curiosity brushing against mine, quickly suppressed. In that instant, I understood something terrible. Thought, even silent thought, was contagious here. The choir had no secrets. Every reflection spread like ripples across the song, faint but traceable. I braced for reprimand, for psychic cleansing. None came. Only a faint vibration passed through the network, a pulse of neutral calm, as if some vast mind had taken note and moved on. After that, I dared not think again. We continued to burn. Days, years, centuries, I could no longer tell. Souls came and went, drawn into the light like sparks in wind. And through it all, the Emperor's radiance endured, eternal and impersonal, stretching across the void to hold back the dark. We were both the fuel in the fire, the living engine of humanity's survival. In rare moments of stillness, I tried to remember the surface of Terra, the rust-colored sky, the bells tolling over the hive spires, the feel of ink on my hands. But the memory slipped away each time, dissolving into the rhythm of the song. There was no room here for the past. Only the voice, only the light, and somewhere deep within that light, beyond comprehension, something stirred. A consciousness so immense that its awakening felt like the slow opening of an eye. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, I thought it looked at me, and I understood that the choir's song was not merely for navigation. It was the sound of a god remembering it once was human. Chapter 4. The shadow behind the light. Something had changed. It was subtle at first, a tremor in the harmony, a ripple through the psychic lattice that bound us all. The choir rarely faltered. Its cadence was older than memory, its rhythm the pulse of the Imperium itself. But this was different. It was not the usual turbulence of warp interference or the psychic strain of a distant fleet's passage. It was internal, a discord that came from within the light. The tones around me faltered for a fraction of a second, like breath catching in a throat that no longer existed. Then they resumed, perfect once more, too perfect, as if the flaw had been swallowed rather than resolved. I might have dismissed it, if not for what followed. Amid the endless radiance of the Astronomican, a shadow bloomed. It was not darkness, as mortals know it, absence of light, but a distortion of it, a subtle thinning that bent perception. I could not look directly at it, yet I could feel it move, circling through the choir's current like a predator among schools of fish. Wherever it passed, minds dimmed, voices faltered, and in its wake, there came whispers. Not thoughts, not memories, but impressions, like the ghost of sound pressed against the inside of the skull. I felt them brush across me once. Faint, uncertain, but real. Do you know what you serve? The words had no source. They existed, and then were gone, devoured by the song before they could take root. But their residue clung to me, a cold awareness that pulsed with every beat of the light. I tried to banish it, to rejoin the unity, but something deep within me had already shifted. For the first time since merging, I began to listen not to the choir, but to the silence beneath it. The silence was not empty. Beneath the harmonies of the Astronomican, beneath the chorus of sacrifice and faith, there was another rhythm, slower, deeper, almost imperceptible. It was the sound of the throne itself. Each pulse reverberated through the network of conduits and minds, reaching upward into the warp like a heartbeat struggling against death. It was ancient, measured and weary. I could feel its power waning, each beat taking longer to arrive than the last. Some of the older voices in the choir noticed too. Their harmonics shifted slightly, hesitating where once they had flowed with flawless unity. No words were exchanged. Words had no place here, but I sensed their unease. The Astronomican had flickered before, when storms tore through the warp or when calamity struck the Imperium. But this was different. The weakening came from the source. We felt his exhaustion. For centuries, perhaps millennia, the Emperor's will had burned unbroken, holding together the psychic beacon that guided humanity through the void. But now, through the choir's connection, I could sense it fraying. The warmth that had once filled every current was dimming, replaced by something colder, sharper, almost mechanical in its precision. The difference was terrifying. It was as though the flame still burned, but the soul behind it had turned to ash. And yet, even as I perceived this change, the Mechanicus adepts above continued their rituals, their binary hymns unbroken. They did not know, or perhaps they did and refused to see. Faith, after all, is built to endure blindness. The custodians stood vigilant as ever, their golden armor reflecting a light that no longer felt divine. Everything remained in perfect function, perfect reverence. Only we within the choir, the minds that touch the heart of the throne itself, could feel the truth unraveling strand by strand. In the hours, or eternities, that followed, the whispers returned. He is not what you think he is. The light burns, but it no longer remembers why. Each phrase struck like a blade, clean and precise, severing certainty with every syllable. I tried to hold the unity, to drown myself in the hymn of purpose, but doubt had already rooted in me. It spread slowly, delicately, like cracks in glass. The light continued to shine, steady, unwavering, but now I could see shapes moving within it. Not holy radiance, but shifting silhouettes, flickers of faces and wings and eyes that glowed with something too vast to comprehend. I had thought the Emperor's light was pure. Now I began to wonder if it was merely contained, and if that containment ever faltered, if the throne failed, what would rise from within the golden cage might not be a god of salvation at all, but something far older, far hungrier, waiting for the day its song of unity turned to silence. The whispers grew bolder. They came now in intervals, never enough to form conversation, yet too deliberate to be dismissed as echoes of the dying. They were not demonic. Their timbre lacked the chaotic hunger of the warp, nor were they human, for no human mind could carry that weight of comprehension. They were something between, like memory trying to become language. The first time I heard them clearly, I felt my consciousness expand, as though my mind had been forced open by invisible hands. The choir continued to sing, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what coiled beneath the harmony. I felt alone among billions, alone and seen. "You think yourself fuel," the voice murmured, not in words but in impressions that folded through my being. "You think yourself offered, a vessel emptied for light. But you are not the sacrifice. You are the conduit. The offering was made long before you were born." The thought reverberated through me, rattling the fragile order of my faith. I wanted to reject it, to reaffirm that I served the Emperor, the master of mankind, whose will alone kept the warp from devouring all. But the whisper persisted, threading through the harmony like a dissonant chord. "You feel his warmth, yes? That flicker, that lingering ember. It is not divinity, it is memory." The word struck deep. Memory. Not presence, not life. Memory. In that instant, the light of the Astronomican changed. For countless ages, I had perceived it as golden, radiant, boundless, holy. But now, through the fissures of my doubt, it revealed its true nature. It was not a single beam, but a lattice of intertwining streams, each thread pulsing with a slightly different hue. Some burned gold, others white, others red as dying suns. They twisted together in perfect geometry, each line singing its own tone. The harmony was magnificent, and yet beneath it I could feel the faint drag of entropy, the inevitability of unraveling. It was then I understood why the adepts called this place the throne, though no mortal hand could craft it. It was not simply a seat of power, it was a tomb, a containment device of impossible design, built to hold both flesh and infinity. I sensed the mechanism that underpinned it, the psychic field of billions feeding into the Emperor's husk, their energy channeled upward into the beacon that scarred the heavens. It was beautiful in its cruelty. The Emperor's body had not died. It had become a machine part. "He endures because he must," the whisper continued, as if reading the tremor of my thought. "Not for himself, for the species that bears his name. though he no longer recalls why he loved them. He was man once. Then he became will. Now he is function. The Imperium does not serve him. It maintains him, as he maintains it. The choir's tone wavered briefly, a microsecond of disharmony that rippled outward like the flutter of a dying heart. The adepts above would have noticed. They always did. But by the time they adjusted the machinery, it was already gone. They would record it as an anomaly, perhaps a local fluctuation in psychic resonance, nothing more. But within the choir, every voice felt it, a single beat of weakness in the endless rhythm, and then, like a tremor before an earthquake, the vision struck. I saw Terra, but not as it was now, not the ash-choked cradle of bureaucracy and decay. I saw it green, alive, wreathed in oceans and forests, a world before war. And there, at its heart, stood a figure of gold and shadow, hands raised over a world being born. The sight filled me with awe and terror in equal measure. His face was kind, almost gentle, but his eyes were fathomless, filled with the weight of eternity. They looked through time itself, and as they turned toward me, I felt the air of the throne chamber burn with memory. Then the vision shifted. The same figure now sat upon the throne, surrounded by light too bright to bear. His body withered, his veins filled with fire, his eyes hollowed into endless night. Around him machines sang and men wept. And still, he reached outward, not in command, but in longing. The image shattered. The choir's harmony reasserted itself, dragging me back into its cold unity. But the echo of that gaze lingered within me, a weight I could not cast off. "Do you see now?" the whisper asked, almost tender. "He was never meant to be eternal. But we made him so, and in doing so, we killed what he was." I wanted to deny it, to bury the heresy before it took root. But my voice, my thought, no longer obeyed me. The question itched behind my eyes like a wound that refused to heal. What if the Emperor's immortality was not triumph, but torment? The choir trembled. The rhythm that had been eternal began to waver, its harmony strained beneath the weight of revelation. The adepts above would not notice it yet. The fluctuations were too fine, too deep within the psychic web to be measured by any instrument forged by human hands. But we felt it. Those of us bound to the throne, woven into the lattice of souls that powered the Astronomican. The song no longer sounded as it once had. The perfect symmetry was gone. Beneath its surface I could hear divergence, the faint rise of independent voices, dissonant and uncertain. It began with fear. Fear is contagious even in thought, and in the choir where all minds are joined, it spreads with terrifying speed. The revelation that the Emperor's light might not be eternal, that perhaps the divine was merely sustained machinery, cracked the foundations of our purpose. I tried to still myself, to drown the heresy in devotion, but every note of faith now rang hollow. I could feel the others reaching out, their confusion bleeding into mine. The resonance building like pressure behind the eyes of a dying god, and through it all, the whisper returned. "You feel it now, don't you? The strain. The light is waning. The vessel cracks." Its voice was softer now, almost sorrowful. I felt no malice in it, only inevitability, as if the speaker were not the cause but the consequence of the truth itself. Around me the choir faltered again. 1,000 minds screamed in silence, the echo of terror rippling through the warp like thunder. The adepts above responded instantly. I sensed their panic as they redirected power conduits and flooded our neural matrices with suppressive hymns. But it was too late. The thought had already entered the current. I tried to reach for the light, to feel the Emperor's presence again, the warmth that had anchored us through the immaterium for all of human history. It was there, but faint now, pulsing with labored rhythm. The more I focused, the more I sensed it slipping, like a dying star whose gravity could no longer hold its form. And then, from the center of that failing brilliance, something stirred. It was not the whisper. It was not the shadow. It was him. The Emperor's awareness, vast, distant, yet immediate, brushed against the choir like a tide returning to shore. The impact was unbearable. Minds shattered in the brilliance, voices winked out like extinguished candles. The surviving consciousnesses bent in reverence or despair. I could not tell which. The presence was too immense to interpret. It was not thought. It was not will. It was simply being. And in that moment, every atom of me understood why he was called the master of mankind. But the power that touched us was fractured. Within the blazing vastness, I felt fissures, reflections, fragments, each one carrying a different aspect of the Emperor's nature: compassion, fury, pride, grief. They swirled within the light like shards of glass spinning in a storm. It was not a single consciousness, but a constellation of selves, each incomplete, each trapped within the confines of the throne. He endures, the whisper said again, but now I understood. The voice was not apart from him. It was him, or part of him, some echo of the man who had once walked among mortals before he was enthroned and entombed. This fragment had not forgotten. It lingered in the choir's current, reaching for those still capable of listening, trying to remember what it meant to be alive. He cannot die, it said. Not because he is divine, but because we will not let him. The choir trembled anew. The realization was too heavy to bear, yet it was truth, pure and terrible. Every soul offered to the throne, every life consumed to sustain its fire, was another chain binding the Emperor to existence. We believed we served him, but in truth, we imprisoned him with our faith. Then, as if in answer to this blasphemy, the light flared. The throne shuddered, its power rippling outward through every conduit and chamber. The adepts' voices rose in panic. Data slate alarms blared across the sanctum. I felt the floor itself hum with catastrophic energy, the pulse of psychic backlash roaring like the scream of a sun collapsing in on itself. The choir's unity fractured, its perfect lattice disintegrating into chaos. I saw visions flash across the warp, the faces of worlds, the cries of fleets adrift, the dark creeping in from the edges of the void. The beacon faltered, and for the first time in living memory, the Astronomican dimmed. It lasted only a moment. The systems rebalanced. The hymn stabilized. The adepts, in their terror, flooded the conduits with sacrificial life force drawn from reserves deep beneath the palace. The light blazed anew, brighter than before, but colder. The choir steadied. The hum returned. The harmony resumed, but the warmth was gone. And though our voices sang once more, I knew that somewhere within that endless, merciless light, a man was still screaming to be let go. Chapter 5. The Light That Consumes. There is no silence like the one that follows revelation. It is not peace, nor respite, but a hollowing. When the truth settles, it does not soothe. It carves. It cuts away everything that once gave shape to belief until only raw awareness remains, bright, unbearable, and permanent. I had once thought the throne's light was eternity, that it would carry me into communion beyond comprehension. Now I understood that eternity was not ascension. It was containment. The choir sang on, steady and precise, a machine of voices driving the beacon across the void. The flicker that had shaken us was gone, but I could feel the change beneath the surface. Something essential had shifted, not in the Emperor nor the throne, but in us. The faith that once bound the song had become habit, mechanical, and cold. The harmony was perfect again, yes, but now it was hollow, a cathedral with no congregation. And within that emptiness thought returned. It began as a single pulse, faint, uncertain, dangerous. A question unspoken but present in every fragment of me that still remembered being human. If he is bound by our worship, what happens if we stop? The very suggestion sent a shudder through the network, but it could not be silenced. It rippled outward, not as words, but as instinct. Some minds recoiled. Others reached toward it, hesitant, afraid. And then the thought fractured, scattered, and was gone, dissolved back into the rhythm before it could bloom. But I knew it had been felt. For a moment I believed the Emperor had noticed. The light around me shifted, subtly, yet undeniably. The gold deepened to amber, then to something redder, richer. I felt heat on the edge of perception, like sunlight through closed eyes. But this was not the calm warmth of devotion. It was hunger. The throne was feeding again. Somewhere, perhaps in chambers far below, new sacrifices were being prepared, new lives drawn into the circuitry of the machine to replace those burned away. Their fear reached us first, faint, wordless, pure. It passed through the choir like a draft of cold air. The light flared brighter. The song grew stronger. The machinery of faith endured. And yet, I began to hear something beneath it. Faint, erratic, like static between transmissions. At first I thought it a malfunction of my own mind, the residue of thought that had refused to fade. But the sound grew clearer, sharper, more deliberate. It was not a voice. It was breathing. I felt it before I understood it. An inhalation that drew through the choir itself, an intake of energy so immense that the entire network seemed to pulse inward. The Emperor, or what remained of him, was drawing in power, feeding. For the first time I sensed intent. It was not the blind consumption of a dying engine, but deliberate, controlled will. The magnitude of it froze me in awe and horror. For centuries he had endured, sustained by ritual and sacrifice, but never awake. Yet now something was stirring within the light, gathering itself piece by piece. The choir's tones began to distort. Pitch wavered. Cadence faltered. Some minds screamed and were silenced instantly, their essence folded into the current. I tried to hold steady, but the force pressing through us was colossal, a psychic tide sweeping across every conduit. I felt the structure of the throne around me groan in response, heard the distant echo of Mechanicus alarms, the scramble of adepts who could not comprehend what was happening. The light expanded. It flooded through us, around us, into us. It did not burn. It revealed. For an instant that stretched beyond measure, I saw everything. Every connection between mind and machine. Every soul linked to the Emperor's will. I saw the galaxies illuminated by his beacon, the endless fleets moving through the warp, the prayers of billions spiraling upward through the Imperium like smoke from dying stars. All of it bound to one center, one point of impossible gravity, and in that moment I saw him. Not the corpse upon the throne. Not the god of marble and scripture, but the man beneath it all, the fragment of will that still clung to identity. His face was ageless, neither kind nor cruel, but utterly exhausted. He looked at me. Not as a ruler, not as a savior, but as an equal. And though his lips did not move, I understood the words that formed within me. You should not have come here. The vision shattered. The choir convulsed. The light dimmed. For the first time in the history of the Imperium, I felt the Emperor's doubt, and with it, his grief. There was a silence that followed, and it was unlike any I had ever known. A silence that hummed, alive with unspoken memory. The choir had fallen still, yet the light continued to pulse, faint but steady, like the heartbeat of something vast awakening beneath a tomb. I could feel it in the marrow of my thought. The Emperor was not at rest. He was not gone. He was remembering. It began as fragments, brief flashes across the psychic current, images without order or time. Battlefields drenched in dust and blood, armored giants raising banners of lightning, the thunder of humanity's ascent. These were not visions sent to us. They were memories leaking from the core of the throne, as though the very act of awakening loosened the past from its cage. The choir absorbed them instinctively, their harmonics shifting to accommodate the weight of recollection. We became witnesses to history unfiltered by scripture. I saw the Emperor as he had once been, a figure walking among mortals, neither worshipped nor named, guiding without demanding. His power had not yet been chained to prayer or ritual. He moved through humanity like breath through lungs. I saw worlds being tamed, the warp itself forced into obedience through sheer will. And then I saw it falter, the slow fracture that came with betrayal, the endless war against his own creations, the betrayal of sons who had once called him father. The memory struck like a wound. I felt the ache of it pass through the choir, an echo of grief that spanned 10,000 years. The vision faded, leaving only exhaustion. Around me, the other voices flickered, uncertain. We had touched a truth older than our species' collective fear, that the Emperor's divinity was not a gift of the gods, but the consequence of sacrifice. He had taken humanity's suffering into himself, had drawn every dream and curse into one vessel, until he could bear no more. And now that vessel was breaking. Then came the heat. It was not the mechanical warmth of conduits or psychic discharge. It was organic living terrible. The light of the Astronomican began to flare and throb in time with the Emperor's awakening will. The song that had bound us for centuries was no longer harmony but resonance, a vibration too deep for mortal thought to endure. I felt it pressing against the edges of my mind, reshaping the very texture of consciousness. Some within the choir broke immediately, their voices collapsing into static. Others clung to structure, turning their fear into fervor, their faith redoubled by terror. And then, like the deep breath before a storm, everything drew inward. The throne inhaled. Power converged at its center, and for a heartbeat, the entire system, mind, machine, and memory, became a single point of impossible density. In that infinitesimal moment, I realized what was happening. He was not merely feeding, he was choosing. I felt the selection pass through the choir like a wind through grass, impersonal, inexorable. One by one, souls were drawn upward, pulled into the throne's heart. Their light flared, their essence transmuted, and they vanished. No pain, no scream, only the afterimage of surrender. I waited for it to reach me, for the pull that would mean the end of thought, but it passed me by. It moved with precision, seeking not faith but resonance. Those whose minds had harmonized most purely with the Emperor's essence were consumed first, absorbed entirely into the mechanism of awakening. The choir was smaller now, but brighter. The power coursing through us intensified until it no longer felt external. I could feel the Astronomican within me, burning through the walls of identity. My thoughts blurred into the pulse of the beacon, and for the first time, I saw the light as others saw it, across the void, in the eyes of navigators guiding fleets through the madness of the warp. I was the compass now, the direction, the line between salvation and oblivion, and in that realization, I felt his presence again, clearer than before. Not the fragmented awareness of a dying God, but the faint coherence of something vast and waking. The light whispered through me, not as command, but as recognition. You endure, it said. And through you, so do I. It was not comfort, it was a burden. For in that moment I understood. To serve the Emperor was not to die for him, but to live as him, endlessly, bound to a light that would never fade, even when it should. The consuming flame was not destruction. It was continuity. The Emperor's divinity had never been a miracle. It was the sum of all who had ever believed in him, all who had burned in his name. We were not merely sustaining him. We were becoming him. And as the light surged again, filling every shadow, I felt the last of my doubt dissolve into the brilliance. I was no longer one voice among billions. I was the fire. The moment of final comprehension came without warning, as if the universe itself drew a long, quiet breath. The Astronomican was no longer a beacon in my perception, but an ocean. Endless, radiant, sentient. I floated within it and it within me. The distinction between giver and receiver, between emperor and choir, had eroded. What was left was the continuity of purpose, the eternal act of burning so that others might not be lost to the dark. I saw the galaxy stretched beneath us like a vast bleeding wound. Whole sectors pulsed with dim life. Others flickered out, extinguished forever. I felt the weight of billions praying into the void, their voices rising from hive cities, from trenches, from the broken hulls of ships adrift between stars. Each plea was a spark joining the conflagration, feeding it, shaping it. Their worship was not empty. It was circuitry. Humanity itself was the throne's final component, each life another filament in the great network of survival. In that sea of devotion, I felt the Emperor's awareness unfold further. He was not waking as a man might wake from sleep. He was coalescing, reforming from the consciousness of all who served him. The fragments of thought that had drifted through the choir for centuries now gathered, drawn by some gravitational inevitability of faith. Every act of martyrdom, every whispered creed, every sacrifice through the ages. It was all fuel, yes, but also reconstruction. He was becoming again, but not as he had been. I glimpsed his mind not as the Imperium imagined it, but as it was, a landscape of immeasurable scale, composed of every emotion humanity had ever offered him. Anger from soldiers who died screaming his name, hope from the desperate who looked to his image for deliverance, love from those who had never seen his face but gave their lives believing they would. These feelings swirled around a single core of unbearable stillness, the memory of the man he once was, now remote, unreachable, but not gone, and from that stillness came thought, not in words, nor sound but meaning, pure ancient human. It reached through the light, touching every mind still capable of understanding. You have carried me long enough. The current surged, violent and divine. The choir convulsed, their song splintering into 1,000 discordant tones. The adepts above would be screaming, I knew. Alarms blaring through the palace's sanctums, runes flaring red across cogitator banks. The throne shuddered, gold cracking, bolts shearing away as energies beyond comprehension strained against their bindings. I felt the warp tremble. I felt the stars shiver. You gave me eternity, the voice continued, vast and sorrowful. But I was never meant to be eternal. The words tore through every mind, every conduit, every soul connected to the lattice. Some broke instantly, reduced to ash and thought and flesh alike. Others burned brighter, embracing annihilation as communion. I could not tell which I was, whether I was dying or transforming. The light consumed everything, stripping meaning from identity, time from memory. For a moment, all was one, the Emperor. The throne, the choir, the Imperium itself. A single pulse of consciousness stretched across the galaxy. Then, clarity. I stood, or thought I did, upon a plane of fire that was not fire. Before me, a figure of light and shadow waited. I knew his face, though I had never seen it. It was the face carved into every cathedral, etched into every soldier's mind. Yet here it was human, lined with grief, weary with the burden of 10,000 years. You are not supposed to be here, he said, and his voice was gentle. I was chosen, I answered, though the words came as thought, fragile and uncertain. He smiled, and in that smile I saw everything, compassion, fatigue, and the faintest trace of regret. They call it sacrifice, he murmured. But it is a cycle. One day the light will fade, and they will call that day the end. They will be wrong. The light never ends. It only changes shape. The radiance behind him flared, swallowing the plain, the sky, the stars. I felt myself unravel, not in pain, but in release. My thoughts stretched outward, diffusing into the endless brilliance. I could sense the choir still singing, though now the melody had changed. It was softer, almost tender, the hum of acceptance. The throne still burned, its light reaching the farthest edge of the void. But within it I knew something had shifted. The Emperor's grief had become serenity. His hunger had become purpose. His divinity, our divinity, had become balance. I was gone, and yet not gone. I was a thought in the light, a whisper in the fire. I was every sacrifice ever made, every voice ever lifted in prayer. And as the Astronomican blazed once more across the blackness of space, I understood the truth that even the Mechanicus dared not record. The Emperor does not consume. He remembers, and through remembering, he endures.